Okay, good evening, everybody, to this last session of the EWP Metamorphosis Student Symposium. And today, for this session, we have a panel of 3 speakers. And the panel is called Psychospirituality, Healing, and Culture. And to start us off today, we have Sucandra, who will speak to us on transforming mind and integrative approach. So all yours, Sucandra.
Yes, thank you, Debashish. Is my screen clear for everybody? Yes.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So thank you, first of all, everyone, for being here today. I would like to discuss with you the importance of integrating Ayurveda and transpersonal psychology for the sake of a calmer mind and a more peaceful life experience. So as an additional reference and background, Ayurveda is about 3,000 years old. It's an ancient system of medicine, while transpersonal psychology is more novel. It emerged as a blend of Eastern and Western philosophy around the 1980s. It's my hope that this talk can be a starting point for us to provide us with an effective way to further plant the seeds of healing the rift. What rift? The rift between objective knowledge and spiritual wisdom. When we do that, we are able to reconcile both science and spirituality in an effective way. So the purpose of this presentation, it is to provide a clear understanding to the importance of the mind and how one can benefit to work on cultivating their mind toward a more intentional and beneficial life. When we acquire knowledge, it is essential that we implement it. We don't just listen and then go about our day, but we really think, we really reflect, and we implement if we find it beneficial to our lives. Otherwise, as neuroscience says, we just lose it. Either you use it or you lose it. So as we develop the right view and the right understanding, the practitioner in the room may not only help themselves, but perhaps be of benefit to their fellow human beings as well. So what does this all mean? Let us gather a foundational understanding on how to prevent and manage imbalance of both physical and mental afflictions or diseases. We begin by dissecting the term for Ayurvedic psychotherapy. When we do so, what we find is sattva vijaya, which literally means mind victory, to conquer the mind itself. Actually, there are 7 main branches or categories to sattva vijaya, or psychotherapy in Ayurveda. But within this ancient branch, ancient medicine, there's a subcategory that we'll focus on today called Daiva Vyapashya Chikitsa. So what this basically can be interpreted as is remedies to negate non-beneficial factors of the mind through divine or spiritual means. Daiva Vyapashya literally translates to mean any therapy that depends on or is linked to a form of spirituality. This concerns the unknown circumstances that go beyond our reasoning faculties, beyond our logical mind. It includes an emphasis on karmas and past lives. So before we proceed further, it's also essential that we have a basic understanding of Ayurveda. As I said earlier, Ayurveda, it's an ancient system of medicine. It sees the whole of an individual, and what it seeks to do is reestablish harmony through the perfect balance, like a tripod of mind, body, and heart for the sake of perfect health. The Ayurveda consists of 3 main elements or doshas called Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Vata, it's the energy of action or movement. This is our thoughts, our natural urges, our breath. Pitta, it's the hunger that we feel, the temperature of our body, and the courage that we have. Kapha, it is our mental stability. It is our unctuousness, our patience. This is very important to know because psychological and physical disorders typically entail disturbances in the flow of energy that occur within one or three of these humors. Thus, if the individual can enter their unique state of homeostasis, the mind can be transformed into a space of healing, into a space of good health, of calmness, of peace. So this connects us to the gunas. The gunas are our primal conscious forces. We have sattva, rajas, and tamas. Sattva, it means purity. This is the leader for clarity of mind. Rajas, action. It is the leader of passion and activity. Tamas, inertia. This is actually the leader of obstruction. This is a tripod, an instrument for balance. And when we think of an instrument, we seldom consider the mind. Yet the mind is the most potent instrument in the world that can either be used as a medicine or as a weapon. So what is the mind? The mind is the seat of the mind. It is the heart. But really, actually, the mind, it is everywhere. It is not just the brain. In fact, it's not the brain itself at all, but it's found throughout the whole body. Even though the mind is everywhere, it can only be associated to one sense organ at a time. And this is why many of us may find that multitasking is truly not possible. It's also scientifically proven. One cannot truly multitask. So it is crucial that if one wants to understand and know their mind, the skill of concentration is absolutely needed. What does the mind include? It includes our basic consciousness. The mind is what causes us to know. It is the analyzer and the perceiver. It is the intention maker. It is the basis of all creation and all manifestation. It is the organ of action. Your senses cannot work without your mind. So now we have a basic understanding of what is the mind, where is it located, and with that in mind, we can safely examine the causes of disease. Due to the mind and intellect fluctuating all the time, every thought you think, it's a fluctuation, right? And once you believe every single thought, millions of thoughts a day you believe, then the mind does the actual opposite of what it knows to be beneficial. I would like to call this, and I think many have heard this term, a crime against wisdom. So here the senses, they become impaired. The senses become led by the mind. What we end up experiencing is intellectual error or derangement, which leads to troublesome actions, which leads to disease, which leads to impairment of intellect and wrong discrimination between what's wholesome and what's unwholesome, between what's eternal and non-eternal. And why is this known as derangement? Because the mind and the intellect, its nature is actually to see clearly. We have an impairment of patience, which leads to derangement of restraint, lack of control. The mind is indulged in sensual pleasures from unwholesomeness. So we need self-control. We need discipline. When we have impairment of memory as a cause of disease, this is where rajas and tamas, passion and distraction, they take over and our reality becomes impaired. We have the maturity of time, so we know that we're born, we get old, and we die. So old age and death-related disorders, they're irremediable. That just happens. Human life. We have maturity of action. This is where actions from our past and our previous lives, they can manifest as disease. So this is karma, or at least one part of karma. Ultimately, what we find is that the mind and karma are the causes of all of our diseases. As we know, transpersonal psychology has the foundation of faculty as spirituality, through which an individual is able to cultivate a more profound human experience within themselves and others. How? By managing the mind. So how do you manage your mind? What can you do? Anything you do, it becomes your samskar, or an impression within your core. What you repeat in your mind, it gets etched onto your brain. Literally, it changes the brain structure. So neuroscience and psychology, they will call this neuroplasticity. So we reflect on the mind. This is secret number 1. This is done through sincere effort and persistence in practice. Again, meditation can help with this, really observing the mind, not just on the cushion, but in every moment of life. Then we keep out of our mind what we don't want to experience. This means that we don't deny, but we live such a noble life that the negativities, they do not come into our life. So this is done through detachment of identification. This is not me, not mine. It's not us. Maybe there's something more. Right? Maybe this is based on something a little bit further. Earlier, we mentioned the gunas. When sattva guna, the purity, becomes a dominant, the mind becomes one-pointed. It becomes sharp. This means that the mind is well controlled. At that point, the mind is without disturbance, and there's calmness. What can you do today? Today, you can take control, conscious control of your intake. This will generate good memories for you. And you know that this is my inner mind, and this is how I'm functioning because I choose to be this way. This means we have the right exposure. You know what you're thinking. You know when your mind is going through a fluctuation. You know what you're consciously putting into your body through your eyes, your nose, what you're smelling, what you're hearing, what you're speaking even, what you're thinking. All the senses we must use. A regulated life, it's so important because this is what leads us to sattvic living. So regulated life, like I said, sattvic living, purity of mind, purity of life. To have basic stability of mind, it means that we have no over-restless state. We willfully direct our attention toward a particular thing. We have higher awareness and will. This means I am more aware than merely identified with the thought process. I don't attach and identify with my thoughts. If you know where you want to go, your will, it will move you in a particular direction, but this is not enough. We have to watch our habits. In order to understand how to live in a sattvic way, we must understand a certain cycle. All right. So when we take our sense data, the composite of what we see, hear, sense, taste, think, etc., plus our memories, they become our thoughts. Those thoughts eventually become our habits. And those habits, they are the neural pathways in the brain. As I said earlier, the physical etching in the brain itself. So we must be intentional. When we think, when we change the nature of the mind, we change the intake content of our sense perceptions. We change our whole life. So we must work on our memories so that they are positive and they give feelings of happiness and give feelings of peace. This doesn't mean that you deny or you reject the traumas or the difficulties. No denial, no rejection, but you fully accept, fully embrace. And one way is we cognitively reframe. Cognitive reframing is very important to have peace of mind. So remember, we have right exposure or ahara. We have rhythmic breathing. We can add this very clearly now. We have rhythmic breathing. We have our posture. We have the good upright posture. Our bodies are able to be healthier. They're less stuck. We are consciously breathing. We have peace of mind. We have good conduct, right conduct, as we call in Buddhism. We have good behavior, external behavior. And we see William James, he actually has a whole theory on the proper external behavior and how that influences the mind. We have a regulated lifestyle and habits. So this includes we deeply think, reflect, ponder, we study, we meditate. Maybe people do prayer instead of meditation. Maybe people do both. Great. And we make service a habit. When we have toxic thoughts, we understand it leads to negative emotions. Negative emotions, it leads to low energy, depression, and mental affliction. So while Ayurveda has the beginning of systemization, it actually has no true beginning as a system of medicine that we know today. Transpersonal psychology, on the other hand, it is recent, and it's just starting to develop within the last century. There's little scientific recognition in the field. Why is that? Due to lack of experimental research. So it can prove advantageous to catch on to some of Ayurveda's ancient wisdom. It needs more rigor in developing and testing theory to carefully put together Western psychological theory and spiritual tradition. Western psychology as a whole discusses conditioning being the central cause of suffering, but yet it fails to identify how we truly become conditioned through our karma. Integration can only happen with the right view, with clear understanding of what is the root of both the wholesome and the unwholesome. This will allow us to have more conducive conditions for realizing the true nature of things, for seeing reality as it truly is, without alteration. So as we close this presentation, I personally would like to make a commitment that I will continue this investigation to bridge the gap further between the East and the West. My root teacher said something very meaningful I would like to share with you all. And she said, it is important to note that in order to transform the mind, we must see that it can be transformed. An understanding that can arise only out of true knowledge of its nature. Let us just recap for a moment. And I recommend you taking a screenshot of this if you're interested in managing mind and preventing disease. This is something actually we used for a nonprofit, and I think it's really meaningful. We practice meditation. Remember to practice meditation even 5 minutes a day. Enough. It changes the neural pathways into your brain. We have a regulated lifestyle, discipline, meditation, routine, conscious intake, right exposure, pranayama, breathing, conscious breathing. We're intentional, and we practice self-compassion. Very essential. So with that in mind, I would like to thank you all for being here today and taking this time to listen.
Thank you, Sucandra, for that presentation about the mind, mind control, and Ayurveda, the principles of transformation. I think we'll move on to our second talk today, and that is David Glover. And David is going to talk to us about cultural reterritorialization of a martial art within the United States, an autoethnographic phenomenological exploration. All yours, David.
Great. Can everyone see just the slides?
Yeah, we can see the slides. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Sucandra. That was actually a nice lead into this presentation because I'm going to talk about some of the things that you talked about, but from a different perspective. And I just want to start by saying in hindsight, I wish I would have picked an easier title, but this is the one I went with. So my name is David Glover. I am a PhD student in East-West psychology. I'm currently working on my dissertation, and it's on my experiences with martial arts as a transformative practice. And so this is just looking at one aspect of that. And just to give you a really brief introduction, it's basically martial arts that come from the ninja in Japan. And so the Ninpo Taijutsu, which can be translated as ninja body science or ninja body techniques, is what I'm talking about for the martial art. And just a little bit of context, the ninja were observers connected to the natural world. And so Ninpo Taijutsu, the movement, basically forms the basis of the fighting arts and ninjutsu, which within the ninjutsu would be other types of self-protection, like protecting the mind, protecting the spirit. And from this context, so these different systems, there are 9 historical schools. Some of them date back about 1,000 years, but they've developed mostly during the Warring States periods in Japan from about the end of the 12th to 16th century. So roughly, 400 years of nearly continuous warfare. And so this is just the context. They're influenced by Tao. So Ninpo, or the philosophy, is influenced by Taoism, Buddhism, and Shintoism, and other philosophies and spiritual practices. There's 9 historical schools. They were gathered together under Takamatsu Sensei, who passed these 9 schools on to Dr. Hatsumi, who's shown here. And in the 1970s, Stephen K. Hayes was the first person from the United States. He's from Ohio. He traveled to Japan, and he was allowed to basically became the first U.S. student to train with Dr. Hatsumi. And and then since then, there's been more folks from different countries, but he's the one who's basically started the transmission of these martial systems to the United States beginning in the late 1970s. And then he added a 10th system, a more modern system as well. And so that's sort of the basket of practices that I'm working with. And just from real quick, before my background, before I did martial arts, I was an endurance athlete. So I competed in triathlons. I focused on Ironman distance triathlons and marathons. And I did that for about 17 years until injury and burnout forced me to stop. And so in 2012 or 2010, I stopped, and then I tried some other things. But as a kid, I always wanted to be a black belt. And so finally in January 2014, I just let me just try martial arts. And so, yeah, a little over 10 years ago, I literally just picked the first school I could that I lived. At the time I lived in Boulder, Colorado. So I just picked the first school I could walk to, and walked in, tried a couple of classes, like, this is great. And so I had none of this background or context at the time. And to go back to the title and how I'm approaching this research, so phenomenology it was originally articulated by Edmund Husserl in the early 1900s, but it's basically the study of lived experience as explored from a first-person perspective. So looking at not, a lot of times I think of research as being looking at numbers and data, but this is qualitative and looking at actual experience. Doing it from the perspective of autoethnography. So autoethnography attempts to bring a culture's characteristics to both insiders and outsiders. So in this case, auto being self. So I'm looking at culture from my personal experience with the hope that what I'm sharing might find some resonance with you all. And then finally, bringing in some post-structuralism ideas and concepts from philosophers such as Deleuze and Guattari as a way to examine and critique modern culture, as well as identify alternative perspectives. And then as well as cultural studies from anthropologists like Clifford Geertz and Ruth Benedict to offer a perspective of on understanding culture. And then as a scholar practitioner, so both the researcher and the practitioner, I bring two perspectives, both as an outsider, so I'm a cultural outsider. So, from a person that's been born and raised in the US studying Japanese martial art, but also an insider from the perspective of being a practitioner. And just to add another layer to this is, in looking at this, I want to be clear that I'm looking at this by, looking at through many different lenses. As Thomas Nagel wrote, it is impossible to leave one's point of view behind entirely without ceasing to exist. And so these different lenses are culture, time period, geography, language, education, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to go through these at all, but the idea is that these are different things that affect how I interpret what I'm experiencing as a practitioner, but also as a researcher as well. And the main one I want to focus on today is looking at differences in culture. And so to bring in an idea, a concept from Deleuze and Guattari is this concept of tree and rhizome as a framework for looking at culture. And you can think of a tree as, perhaps a better picture might be a picture of a family tree where you have, your great grandparents, and then they have kids, and then they have kids, and they have kids, and it branches down. And a tree is very, it's a fixed hierarchy. There's clear relationships between the different branches. On the other hand, a rhizome, you could think of like a mycelium or mushroom network, or a grove of aspens, or tubers. But the idea is there is no clear hierarchy. There's no, to quote Deleuze and Guattari, there's no beginning or end. It is always in the middle between things, interbeing. And the rhizome is alliance, uniquely alliance. So the idea here is that, unlike the tree, which has these clear relationships where you can move up and down, the rhizome, you can go in any direction. Another metaphor they gave is the idea, if you think of the rhizome as a map. So I just pull the map off the internet, but you can go in all these different directions, and if like one street gets blocked, I can go another way. So there's all these different options. And the example of the tree, they use the term tracing. So I can kind of, if I'm looking at the tracing, I'm actually picking a path that I'm traveling. And so I'm going to use this concept throughout this presentation, and also try to present this as a tree and a rhizome. So I may go off in different directions, but I'm also taking you on a specific path as well. So another question: what is culture? It's one of those words that I think can take on a lot of different meanings. And so I really like this simple description from Clifford Geertz. And you can read it, but the key point I want to emphasize that he says is it's a context. And at one level, it can be very broad. So like I'm in the East-West psychology program. So East and West, Eastern culture versus Western culture. But it can also be scaled down. So for example, different parts of the US have different culture. For example, I live in New England now, which has a different culture than Northern California. And it can scale down even further. I mentioned I participated in triathlon, which is a swim, bike, run event. Triathlon culture has a different culture than mountain biking culture. It has a different culture than road cycling culture, for example. Families have different cultures. And I like, when I think of culture, I like to use the analogy as a container. So if I talk about modern US culture, I'm talking about the modern US as like a container. And the one thing to point out is, as a fish swims in water, oblivious to the water in which it swims, we can often be oblivious to the cultures in which we swim. And so another point to culture is, from Ward Goodenough wrote that within a culture are systems of standards for perceiving, believing, evaluating, and acting. And I just want to, so I went to, these are two different schools I've gone to. My undergrad was at the United States Naval Academy, had a very different culture. So different, ways of acting and talking and showing up than CIIS. Not necessarily either one is good or bad, but just different. So going back to this presentation, so the question is, what happens when a practice like Taijutsu changes cultures? So it's deterritorialized from Japan. It started in a pre-modern culture in Japanese bodies in a combat context, and it gets brought over into the US, into modern culture, US bodies, and then more of a self-defense, personal growth context. Ruth Benedict, who wrote an interesting book on the patterns of Japanese culture, she was commissioned by the US government right at the end of World War II to help set policy for Japan in terms of what to do, because the Japanese had just surrendered after at the end of World War II, and so when I thought this was a really powerful quote, but the idea that the lenses through which any nation looks at life are not the ones another nation uses. It is hard to be conscious of the eyes through which one looks. So the idea here is not only do we as individuals have our own lenses, but as cultures, we have lenses too. And so another term to throw out there is this idea of Orientalism. And what happens is when, from when I say broadly the West, so in my location, speaking from living in the modern US, but a lot of times when these practices like martial arts or yoga are brought to the US, they may include the distorting lens of Orientalism. And Orientalism is basically can be generalizations, stereotypes, preconceptions, and expectations of Eastern culture. So the thing, Eastern culture being exotic, intriguing, different. Unfortunately, this also often brings in an element of ethnocentrism in interpreting another culture through a lens that assumes one's own culture's inherent superiority over that of others. And so this is one of the schools I studied at, and just some of these themes come out of time-tested results, art purified by the sword. So this idea of like this unique and martial art that's now being taught in the U.S. And so for the specifics of this examples I want to give from my own experiences is I mentioned I started in the school in Colorado. I switched to a sister school in Southern California, and I'm now in New Hampshire. And so I want to, kind of group the first two together. I'm going to call them number one and then number two. And just as a basis of comparison of these are supposedly the same martial art, but just they're being treated and taught and experienced differently. So number one, I just pulled this off the website, but the question is, what does a school promote about itself? And in this case, you can read the text, but it says, in this case, you can improve flexibility, balance, and strength. So in the modern US, physical practices like yoga and martial arts are typically implemented as technical, goal-oriented regimes that promote health, fitness, stamina, and body beautification, which are benefits consistent with Western cultural norms. The irony is that Ninpo Taijutsu, the ninja, given that they were often, spies or, in situations they didn't want to be seen, an aspect of their movement and their fighting is very imperceptible. So they moved. It was very. If you watched it, you can't even see what happened. It was just over. So this is sort of this idea of you're improving these physical attributes. It's almost counter to what the actually art does. So just compare this to a second, my second, or actually my third school. In this case, they're talking about shinobi science, and it's not promising body beautification or physical sama, but actually it's talking about a training method. So a training method based on a system of experimentation. And it's interesting for those of you that are familiar with integral yoga. I remember when I took the integral yoga psychology class and reading about Sri Aurobindo and how in his record of yoga, he documented his own system of experimentation. But in this case, the idea here is the school is promoting a process of experimentation to learn. So how is Taijutsu taught? And this is actually, I'm going to go briefly on this, but typically, techniques can be packaged into kata, which might be a series of techniques. So example here would be in step 1, step 2, step 3. You see step 1, the person on the left is the person in the self-defense situation. The person on the right is reaching out. In step 2, you can see they've grabbed them. In step 3, the person on the left is defending himself. And from when I first learned this in my first 2 schools, I was taught that these were steps. My understanding was they were steps to be memorized. So these were things, basically like an if-then statement, very tree-like. It's very structured, like if this happens, then I do this. And similarly, the curriculum was taught in these different levels. And so that started with yellow was earth, and water, fire, wind, void, up to black. And there was a series of techniques, like 12 techniques at each level. And then you practice techniques, go to class, and they get tested, demonstrate them. And then after a minimum of 9 months, you go up to the next level and so on. And what it did is it created a hierarchy within the classes as well. So there were classes at different levels. So if you were down at the yellow belt level, you couldn't train up. And then typically what happened is folks up here wouldn't train down, and you lined up by rank. So it's very structured. And it's interesting, this whole belt system is a relatively new thing. Jigaro Kano, I think late 1890s, early 1900s, he invented judo, but he actually set up the belt system as a way to keep students motivated. So rather than day training, it was a way to give them some type of external validation for what they're doing. So it's not something that was historical at all. So I want to share, this is my current teacher, and I'm in New England, and when New England has its own culture, and one of the cultural attributes of New England is sarcasm as a sport. And so a lot of times we'll hear stuff like this. And the point I want to share with this quote is it's this idea of like, I'm learning these things, but do they really work? So I began to question things. I'm collecting all these techniques. I collected 60 techniques to get the black belt, but the question is, really work? And so since then, I have a different understanding of these steps, and through working with different teachers, asking questions, is the idea of, instead of looking at these steps as things to memorize, but looking at them as relationships. So going back to this idea of rhizome, you could also think of them as alliances. So, what is the link between these two things? Like, even before this even happened, like, why are these people in this situation? Why is this person reaching and not punching? Why is he, doesn't have a knife? Why is it, this person on the left, standing with his feet, slightly bladed? So in this context, when learning these things, instead of these things becoming the teacher showing us these things to memorize, the teacher may break apart, between 1 and 2, and let's look at this relationship and said, okay, well, let's practice grabbing. Okay, how does someone actually grab to have an effect? Then why is, number 2, why is this person, you can see this little blow up here, he's the person on the left, he's actually got his hand up next. So it's like looking at these relationships and understanding the whys of things. Another point, running short on time, but culture not only affects how we perceive things, but how we move. So Marcel Mauss gave the example of when you put British infantry with French infantry, they actually marched differently. They couldn't march together. Feldenkrais, who was a judo practitioner, and this gets to the second example, is the idea that it's better to improve the way we do things than what we do. For how we do things is of more importance than what we do. Skip that. This idea too, if I can take this relational perspective. So if I'm practicing yoga asanas, for example, it's not about just getting to the poses, but looking at the connection between them. Can I move them, do them in a way that's more integrated, more balanced? What does US modern culture value? So I'm just going to show some pictures, sports, gadgets, weight loss, big trucks. Guy Debord, he calls modern culture a consumer of illusion. So the idea of, things are material and external. And just coming it back to these 2 examples, and they're different. I didn't know when I started, and on the one on the left, it's very, externalized, like wearing uniforms and belts. The one on the right, a little more informal, but a different level of training. But the idea too is just it was an ongoing process of discovery. Skip that. Real quickly, just to come back to this idea that, as you're listening to this, you're also listening through these different lenses and more. And I'll leave you with a quick metaphor, the parable of the frog living in a well. And if the frog's living in the well and he never leaves the well, all he sees is, you might see the sky, but that's his whole world. And the question is, if the frog jumps out, what might, it might be scary. I mean, there might be a hawk or something, but there also might be some really cool stuff too. Bringing it back to Duluth's, Duluth gave the metaphor of a spider spinning a web and listening for signal. So this presentation draws on a piece of my dissertation research and emerged through this process like a web. I didn't know how it was going to end up. And it's also an experiment. I'm testing ideas and approaches to support my dissertation research. And like the spider, I'm also listening for signals. So if I were to summarize what this is all about, it's seeing through the clouds of deception in life situations, whether imposed by self or others, is a matter of clarifying our perception by removing the cultural and emotional barriers that we've permitted to grow up as blinders around us. And in summary, we're all looking at this from different perspectives. Culture is complex, and I have no definitive answers. My answers are partial at best and subject to change. And my hope here is to stir your curiosity. I'm dropping a pebble in the pond and watching it ripple it out. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was a very thought-provoking talk with a lot to really give us in terms of not merely technique, but also the context in which technique emerges and what's behind it. So we'll carry on to the third and last talk of this session, and that is going to be Hemalatha Swaminathan. Hemalatha will talk to us about the psyche, a psycho-spiritual perspective on the psyche. So on to you, Hemalatha.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to share my screen as we start. I just want to know that this is visible.
It is. It is, Hemalatha.
Okay. So, just a moment. Yes, so today's presentation is
We're
an
actually
excerpt
in
from...
your edit view, Hemalatha. I think earlier at some point you struck. Yeah, now it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So today's presentation is an excerpt from my dissertation research, and I am exploring the psyche using an embodied ritual, and I'd like to present two thinkers who I came across, who I encountered during this process, and would like to share how in this paper I delve into the fascinating journey of individuation as described by Hume and the journey of integration as described by Sri Aurobindo through two intriguing illustrations that I encountered during my research. These illustrations have been instrumental in comprehending Sri Aurobindo's and Hume's perspectives on integration and individuation, respectively. The striking resemblance in the illustrations piqued my curiosity, leading me to explore how Hume and Sri Aurobindo, contemporaries from different geographical locations, interpreted the psyche. By studying and highlighting concepts shared by Hume and Sri Aurobindo, this research sought to demonstrate how prominent scholars from diverse fields, psychology and spirituality, came together around one fundamental idea, that is, integrating various aspects of oneself as necessary for personal development and growth. In my understanding, Hume popularized individuation which is unifying the conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche to form a whole. Sri Aurobindo highlighted the importance of integration for personal growth and spiritual and psychological well-being. Hume and Sri Aurobindo emphasized the significance of accepting and reconciling all aspects of ourselves, from psychological to spiritual. Their work illustrates that personal and spiritual development involves understanding and accepting every facet of nature for optimal living. So I'd like to communicate my understanding and Hume's notion of individuation. I'd like to share Sri Aurobindo's principle of integration and kind of provide a comparative study of how I have understood these two concepts. Hume's theory of individuation places the self at the core of human consciousness, aiming for wholeness and equilibrium by integrating conscious elements with the vast realms of the unconscious. As I delved into the theory of individuation, I discovered that it entails a profound exploration of one's psyche, acknowledging both the conscious and the unconscious aspects, leading to a deeper connection between the self and the universe. This transformative journey, though challenging, is ultimately enlightening, leading to a profound sense of purpose and fulfillment in life. David Johnston, a practicing psychologist who considered Hume his direct guide, emphasized that the primary goal of individuation was the assimilation of the four functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. He further explained that in this process, an individual's superior function is assimilated with the auxiliary and tertiary functions, and to a great degree to the inferior fourth function. Hume discovered this goal of psychological development through assimilation in his journey of confronting his unconscious, which began somewhere in 1917-18 through dreams. Hume mentioned that dreams are indispensable in human experience, revealing symbols, archetypes, and collective elements within our unconscious. Hume's personal experiences, particularly his house dream, played an important part in developing his groundbreaking theory of the collective unconscious. Through his dream, in which hidden rooms represented aspects of his psyche, he better understood this deeper storehouse of shared human experiences and symbols that existed beneath our conscious awareness, the collective unconscious. The house dream marked the inception of Hume's theory of the collective unconscious, signifying a pivotal moment when he embarked on a personal exploration of its significance, distinct from a mere adaptation of Freud's ideas. Hume, in his essay, The Psychology of the Unconscious, critiques Freud's comprehension of the unconscious as the storehouse of thoughts and feelings that one repressed as they were unacceptable to society. Freud's theory suggested that when repressed material from the unconscious could be brought to the conscious mind, it could improve one's memory by recollecting past experiences. Hume argued that if this theory were accurate, it could endow one with an exceptional memory that would forget nothing. He clarified that such integration of the unconscious and the conscious based on recall of past events is possible only to a limited extent. Freud's strategy that the unconscious could be exhausted in this manner of recollection of past events had not been fulfilled. Intrusions from the unconscious continued unimpeded, and Hume elaborated that this was because the unconscious contained not only repressed thoughts and feelings, but also unexplored ones that have not yet reached the conscious. Hume explained that these intrusions might be of occurrences that have not been consciously acknowledged and have stayed beneath the threshold of consciousness. They have been absorbed subliminally beyond one's conscious awareness, and such a content might only surface in a moment of intuition or deep contemplation, leading to a later realization connecting the event to one's conscious awareness. Hume explained that the unconscious comprised two distinct layers, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. He mentioned that within the personal unconscious resided material stemming from one's own unique experiences, possibly once part of the personal conscious, but relegated to the personal unconscious through repression. Beyond individual experiences, the concept of the unconscious extended to include collective elements shared by humanity, which Hume earlier in his career called dominance, as they influenced human behavior before settling on the term archetypes. Now I'd like to share the Hume's map of Psyche, which I have sourced from Peter D. Freeman. And I understand from this figure that the self, which is in the lowercase s, is equated with the ego, the psyche's conscious aspect. The shadow that you see in the second, in the inner ring, is an archetype that is part of the personal unconscious that an individual would have to explore, understand, and embrace in their transformation journey. This exploration could enable the individual to go beyond the one-sidedness of the ego, embrace the shadow by making it conscious, and continue integrating with the self, which is in the center. In figure 1, the self in the center, the personal unconscious, and the ego are represented in 3 concentric circles. As the psychological awareness of the individual expands, one experiences individuation and wholeness. I'd like to present a similar a figure that I found similar from, and this has been sourced from the book Are Many Selves, which is from the selections from the works of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. In this figure, we see 3 concentric circles, like figure 1. In the center of figure 2 is the psychic being, which Sri Aurobindo described as the innermost being, Purusha, that supports the outer and inner beings, the Prakriti. Based on the Hindu philosophy of rebirth, Sri Aurobindo described the psychic being as an evolving soul that passes through cycles of life and death, growing from life to life. The growth of the psychic being is dependent on the evolution of the outer and inner beings. Sri Aurobindo called the psychic being the Purusha, which is waiting to expand and unite with everything. However, he said this could be achieved only by harmonizing and unifying the outer beings, which are, as you see in the outer circles, with the psychic being, which is the Purusha at the center. When the psychic being becomes dominant, which Sri Aurobindo stated can be achieved through sadhana, the transformation of an individual and union with the divine becomes complete. He described this as a process when the Prakriti of ignorance transformed into the Prakriti of knowledge. This Sanskrit verse from an ancient Indian text, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, describes this movement of integration as Asato Mam Satkamaya, Tamaso Mam Jyotirkamaya, which means, may we move from ignorance to truth and from darkness to light. Meera Alfasa of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram, also known as the Mother, described this integration movement as a journey that required sustained effort, deep concentration, and forgetfulness of ego. She urged each one to get in touch with their psychic being, probably which Hume referred to as the self, as it is not inaccessible and has the potential to put us in touch with divine forces. On this journey of knowing one's psychic being, Meera Alfasa explained, the Mother explained, that one can reach the psychic being directly through physical, mental, or vital consciousness. She added that it is not a gradation or an ascent journey where one must cross several layers, but a process of interiorization where it is possible to reach the psychic being directly without going through several states. I'd now like to present my understanding of these 2 illustrations. Sri Aurobindo is known to have claimed that his yoga was new as it focused on the ascent and descent of consciousness with the objective of divine fulfillment. He contended that in the old yoga, the focus was on the ascent of the consciousness, while any descent was incidental. Hume's path of individuation, with its objective of divine fulfillment, through the ascent and descent of consciousness was also new in the Western world that had alienated from the ancestral psyche. In both individuation and integration, the goal was cosmic, which meant that the ascent or descent of consciousness was not only a divine fulfillment for the individual, but also used for earth consciousness. This emphasis on the translation of individual transformation to the collective led to earth conscious community living in the case of Sri Aurobindo, and exploration of concepts like archetypal or cosmic realization in the case of Hume. David Johnston highlighted that Hume's path of individuation came closest to Sri Aurobindo's path of integration in the manner that it encouraged one to completely accept the psyche and examine it thoroughly. Such examination required one to deeply engage with the psyche, and this brought about psychological and spiritual growth. However, unlike Sri Aurobindo, Hume did not emphasize supracosmic achievements like nirvana, non-dual reality, etc. until later in life, closer to his death. Hume acknowledged that surrender of the individual to the cosmic self was necessary for spiritual growth and to experience wholeness and oneness. And this was also brought about by a dream that he had later in his life, closer to his death. Both Sri Aurobindo and Hume viewed the process of transformation as a ladder that linked all levels of beings and not a source of transcendent experiences. Sri Aurobindo explained this as the linking of the physical, mental, and vital beings to integrate with the psychic being, while Hume explained this as an extension of the ego consciousness. Johnston remarked that both Hume and Sri Aurobindo built a ladder from the material being to the non-dual reality or nirvana. The difference lay in the fact that Sri Aurobindo's integral approach aims to directly achieve this goal by skirting around the psyche, while Hume's path of individuation diligently works through the psyche, leading to intensive and extensive formation of the being. I share my painting here to express what this journey of confronting the unconscious and assimilation of the functions of the consciousness has been like for me. The tree that you see in the painting is indicating that this process has been multidimensional, it has been dynamic, and that there has been an experience of an emergence, almost like a movement from the spine to from the background to the foreground. And I'd like to say that coincidentally, I came upon Hume's dream of a magnolia tree in the middle of a dark island in Liverpool. In the dream, despite the dark surroundings, the sun lit up the magnolia tree, and he saw a tree that was lit in the center with cherry blossoms. The tree was lit by the sun, but it was also the source of light. For Hume, this dream was instrumental in providing a goal for the process of individuation, and that was a movement from the dark island to the bright center of the tree, a movement from darkness to light, very similar to Tamaso Mam Jyotir Kamaya. I would like to share the references for this work and would like to stop here.
Thank you, Hemalatha. Wonderful, beautiful, profound comparative study. Do we have any other speakers today, Jonathan? Okay, so wonderful.
No, we've completed.
I think we have 3 beautiful speakers today, with a lot of synergy. I think this entire the symposium has been designed very well with the different speakers and the different panels that have actually opened up many ideas that kind of resonate with one another. Today's 3 talks, as far as I was listening to them and thinking about them, reflecting on them, have also very deep resonances. From almost a kind of an external point of view, they they're being categorized as world component of East-West psychology, but they all have very strong Eastern elements. At the same time, there is in all of them a hermeneutic approach where there is an attempt to bring at least two cultures into conversation. And that's what actually really intrigued me about all the talks and the way that is attempted to be achieved as the different speakers were trying to bring it out. I think one of the takeaways that I got from Sucandra's talk, where she was referring to techniques for the transformation of the mind, for bringing peace to the mind, is what she ended with, the quotation where she's saying, in a sense, that I'm paraphrasing, that for the transformation of the mind, you need to know that the mind can be transformed. It seems like a circular statement, but it is a very profound statement. And it can go in many directions. It can be understood in a variety of ways. But it's really where something in us already knows that something can be done. And it's getting to that point. Again, I'd like to draw on Hemalatha's talk where she's referring to the unconscious as that area in Jung or in the psychic consciousness in Sri Aurobindo, as that area where something resides that can actually, go out to the other layers and is prior to them, is in a sense something which is cannot be contained or cannot be fully spoken for. There's more to it that can be actually articulated. And so these elements relate to, in the way in which David was couching his talk on martial arts to what Deleuze and Guattari call the rhizomatic, because that is the area or the zone where the kind of hierarchies meet at the point where they haven't yet become a hierarchy. It's a point where different hierarchies may be constituted, but which is pre-hierarchical in that sense. So one of the images with which David ended actually is a very, very profound one. And you can see that several of his images relating to the rhizomatic, the map, for example, the plant, the rhizome, refer to this zone, as it were, from which other kind of layers or languages emerge. And so when we are talking about cross-cultural hermeneutics, when we are talking about different languages, and we saw that with Sucandra's language, which is developed out of Indian yoga, out of Ayurveda, Buddhism, all these very sophisticated languages for transformation, or with Hemalatha's, where she's using two different languages: the language created by Jung, the language created by Sri Aurobindo and the mother of integral yoga, languages that can sort of resonate, speak to each other, and at the same time are not exactly the same. When we're going from these sophisticated Indian languages of yoga to a Western understanding, then we come to the cultures. That's what David was talking about, culture as context. The fact that in our reception of these languages, we bring our own contextual understandings, the languages that are in us. And it is only when we can get to a point where these languages are being generated, there is some kind of zone where these languages dissolve, as it were, and then are found again, that they suddenly start revealing their fertility and their creativity, the fact that somebody created them. And we can reach that zone of creativity from which these systems arise. And so from the viewpoint of praxis, which is what all these three talks were about, a thing to understand that was resonating in all these talks, but I would say to some extent was part of the explicit content of David's talk, has to do with how one gets from a language that's received. You receive it as training, you receive it as partly verbal and partly non-verbal praxis. You receive it through dreams, and then connect it, as it were, to languages that you're receiving from the outside. You get it from a certain contact of the external zone that Hemalatha was talking about, the zone of our differentiated and divided reality that is accepting these languages, understanding, interpreting these languages, and doing with them what we are trying to achieve. So we receive our practices and our understandings through these languages. But at some point, there is something else in us that is also receiving it. It's not just that which understands the language, but something else is receiving it. Call it the unconscious, call it the psyche, call it, the deep mind, the one that knows that it can be transformed. At some point, that has to kick in. And getting to that zone, so there is a kind of doubleness that occurs. Getting to that zone is the touch of the rhizomatic. When the rhizomatic is touched, one may not even know it, but it starts making itself known. And also one's praxis and understanding suddenly start becoming more creative. One bypasses, and I'm not using this in the negative term of spiritual bypassing. I'm talking about one sets aside the actualities that one received. One can use them, but one is operating from a point that is deeper than them. And so I would like to conclude by exploring or interpreting another aspect of what David ended with, which is the image of the cobweb, of the spider and its web. That particular image has been given in a number of places by Deleuze, and actually it's also related to Bergson. He's talking about Bergson, and Bergson gives this image as well. The spider he's talking about is actually a mythical spider. It's almost like the spider of the Upanishads. That is the golden spider that's spinning its web and then can swallow it up at the same time. Its web is spun out, contains or captures the entire world in it, and then it can disappear at the same time. And in the case of the Deleuzian spider and its web, what he's saying is that the spider is there on the web, but the spider is not localized on the web. The spider is the web, and the spider is everywhere on the web. A signal that comes on the web shakes the web at a certain point, but the spider doesn't go to that point. Here, as soon as it sort of shakes, the spider is there, right at that moment, at infinite velocity. This, in a way, I would say, is the very aim of the martial art. This is the aim of the journey from the psyche to the signals of our outer world. Because the differentiated and divided reality is actually an illusion. And we are everywhere on it. And knowing that, that is the real rhizomatic. The rhizomatic knows and is wherever it receives the signal, immediately, all at once. And at some point, somewhere in one's journey in understanding these languages that we are using to practice, we sense that and we contact that. And that is the real beginning of our journey. So I think that was the lesson I got from these three talks. And with that, I think I'll open it up for questions, reflections, and conversations among the three speakers and with all the audience. So I see Scott's hand up. So Scott, go for it.
I put my hand up. I was anticipating that maybe the three speakers wanted to interact a bit, but I have some practical questions. One for Hemalatha. What is the reference for Jung's dream that you were referring to with the trees? Do you have a which book it's in, or?
It's in Robert Johnston's book, which I can share the link with you.
Oh, it's Robert Johnston.
Yes.
So he's not Jung himself. Did he report it in any of his own work?
I think so. I will share
okay.
the link with you. Yes.
Okay. I can get it then. And then David, I was just curious, and maybe Debashish can chime in, but the rhizome that in which the spider web is representative of our oneness, our whole consciousness. Does that come from a specific place in Deleuze's works?
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the what Debashish just said. I pulled an example. He talks about it in two regimes of madness, and he's talking about a narrator in Proust and the narrator having the spider strategy, and so yeah, I did
Regimes of Madness. I haven't read that one. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, that's okay. I'll look it up.
Yeah, I can send you the page number. It's text and interviews, but so it's basically an interview he's doing. But that's where I got it from. But I'm curious to read more into what he's said elsewhere. So.
Yeah, he refers to it in a number of places. But Scott, the rhizome is in 1,000 Plateaus.
Okay, I've got that book, so I can remember that reference. But I'm just interested in the image of the spider web, and yeah. Thank you. I really appreciated the context and everything that everybody's works here. Just it deepened my own understanding of a lot of things, and and opened up my own curiosities too. So it's a blessing to have participated. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, it was Sucandra, it was interesting just listening to learning about Ayurveda, and then I appreciate, because through my own research, I'm looking at neuroscience and understanding, neuroplasticity, and then but also like the plasticity of the body as well, like use it or lose it. And so it's interesting to learn about a practice that's been around for a few thousand years, and there's some aspects of modern science are just starting to understand and explain. And then Hema, yeah, I appreciate it. I like the being able to look at the two perspectives between Jung and Sri Aurobindo, and It's, I guess the more I try and understand, look at these practices, understand it, and start to see, I mean, there's like pockets in I use the US just because that's where I'm located, but you know, like somatics and you know, some of the modern neuroscience and even like biomechanics. Most of biomechanics still assumes this lever and gear model for how the you know, the joints, you know, the muscles move the joints around a, you know, hinge. And it you know, that goes back to Borelli in like 1680. So he wasn't even a scientist. He was like a mathematician. And it's only like in the last, kind of like with somatics and, you know, some somatic psychology, looking at the mind throughout the body, like biomechanics is with this idea of biotensegrity is the idea of we're actually you know, we're tensegritous shapes, you know, kind of like the Epcot dome. So yeah, it's interesting there's little pockets in like modern, you know, Western culture that have figured out parts of this stuff, but there's a lot of wisdom in these other practices that have known about this stuff for years. So.
Thanks for saying that, David. As I heard you, David, and Hemalatha, I think also these are the reasons why I think we need to bring Eastern thought into the West more, not just the ideas, but through data-driven research. We have to have the data because it seems we're just like, oh, here's this, and you should listen to this, and here's why. But people do not listen unless they can experience it for themselves, or they hear stories and then they choose to experience for themselves. So I think this program in East-West psychology, it's so fascinating because it really opens that door to bridge the East and the West and to make a meaningful contribution to psychology. So I hope all of us here can do that if we choose to.
I'd just like to add that to what Sucandra was saying, and I think being on this journey has helped me understand how some scholars like David Johnston, and I also have Stephen Herman, who have you know, provided a rich source of literature in terms of connecting the East and the West with Jung and Sri Aurobindo, like I spoke today, or Stephen Herman's work has been in terms of connecting Jung and Swami Vivekananda's work. So I think it's wonderful that we have some work existing, and if we can really take this forward in our own work, I think that would be really nice.
Judy.
Hey, everybody. I unfortunately missed your presentation, Sucandra, but I'm looking forward to watching the recording. Yeah, and I just wanted to say I really enjoyed both your presentations, Hema and David, and have been thinking a lot. Like I wanted to just say, because Debashish was talking about the hermeneutics of language, and like I'm fascinated, Hema, with this idea that these two works of art, like just this idea of art as a language itself, or in other words, like this like pre-verbal language of being creative, which kind of ties back to Jonathan's presentation yesterday too, like the heterogenetic, and then also the pre-verbal kind of like what you present. Like I was just making these connections with what you were doing too, David, about like just the like move, like the somatics, right? The language of sensation, and just like how that is so layered. And so I'm just, I don't know, I don't have like a question, but just kind of wanted to share that comment because that's been on my mind a lot since our discussion yesterday about this like inversion of sensation and kind of like from the inside out heterogenetic. I kind of felt like there were some threads there in both of your presentations today that felt exciting to me. So I'm going to reflect on them some more, but thank you. Just wanted to say that.
You know, and I would just add that images, you know, from visions and let's just say enactments in rituals, or are also that pre-language, pre-verbal experience, and it is a language unto itself. And in my experience, it's actually, it frees it, you know, with working with my clients with images, it frees them from being captive of the language that they're stuck in. And so it really, it opens the door for a lot of imaginal things that and associations that language might foreclose. So I would just add image to that, those two other languages.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up the thread of Sucandra, when you were speaking about that opening when somebody can choose to experience something for themselves. And that's, I think, a really important question when considering culture too. And relating to how in Western psychology, it doesn't necessarily question how we become conditioned. It assumes certain things. And in that, it also limits the kind of choices that we have in terms of how we choose to experience things. And I was just in my mind thinking about that relationship between the rhizome and the arborescent or the tree, and how in Deleuze's philosophy, in Deleuze and Guattari, they're presenting this idea of the rhizome as a kind of invitation and almost an antidote to what they would consider to be the epistemic conditions, in terms of to choose to experience something different for ourselves. We need different images, like what you said, Scott. There needs to be a different image that is not a static image that we can then kind of reintegrate everything into a new order, but to actually displace the order of things and allow them to become. And an image, and Debashish, you brought up Bergson, and the notion of the image it's a super important concept, I think, because it's between subject and object. It's between something that is outside of us, that is within us. It's between being something that we can feel working from within us out, but it also has its own powers of becoming, and so that's just, I guess I just wanted to riff a little bit on that, and like in how we organize images and how we consider the forces of culture as kind of giving us that question of like, okay, well, how is that my context, culture as context, giving me the opportunity to choose to experience certain things? And what is the role of the tree in that? Because one thing that sometimes people misunderstand about Deleuze and Guattari is that they are kind of inverting the tree structure. Well, in many senses they are. They're inverting it for the rhizome. But what happens if we get rid of the tree altogether? And it's they might, in some sense, they might read as if that's going to be a new ideal, but at the same time, all of the presentations still presented, we need different images of what this tree seemed to have represent in our cultural inheritance, yet kind of became too much at the expense of the rhizome. And so that's just a question I have. It's like there still is a search for something that could be universal, or there is a search for something within ourselves, whether it's a new notion of identity or self, or like a sattvic outlook, a sattvic consciousness disposition. But how is it that if we just find ourselves using those concepts and those notions in the older paradigm, it could just very much fold back into just becoming a tree like tree-like image at the expense of the rhizome. And that's where I think it's just a big question for everybody in that sense, in terms of how we're doing scholarship and how we're doing our self-transformation. But I think it's also a big question, Debashish, you always are emphasizing the relation between these individual spiritual practices and the context in which we find ourselves, and how we can change that context how we can change that culture so as to find something that can actually hold, a different type of image of a tree, maybe, that can hold, multiplicity in oneness. Thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. And actually, I'd like to, sort of invite Hemalatha to speak. She has her hand up, but even apart from that, she presented a tree as the image. So Hemalatha, please, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to add on what Scott mentioned about the image, and Jonathan then took it forward, is of it being an universal, something in the universal consciousness, and maybe that's what Jung referred to as the collective unconscious, and an image, and the archetypes that exist, and an image takes us possibly closest to the archetype of, and so maybe it's a good thing to ask ourselves, what is the archetype of a tree, or the image of the tree, the archetypal image of a tree, what is it in the collective unconscious for us? What does it, what kind of connectedness or search does that convey for us? So when I presented the tree, so in the painting, it became a tree. It was not like one intends to paint a tree, but it just when the colors and so it turned out to be a tree. And it was like an image, an archetypal image of probably something that was indicating something in the collective unconscious. And I think that is left to exploration in terms of what is that archetype in the collective unconscious that this image is directing one towards.
Yeah, it's a beautiful set of reflections and questions. I want to kind of probe it a little more, in fact, and these images like the rhizome, or even the one about the spider and its kind of palpating web, a web of palpations. In other words, whatever signal kind of hits it immediately is translated throughout the web. And the spider is also immediately at that point. These are, one may say, paradoxical images. And Bergson uses the term movement image for this. This is actually the essence of the movement image. The movement image, because an image tends to be static. When we normally think of an image, it's static. And there is a way of thinking about the archetype also as static, but actually it's not static, it's dynamic. And so, like Hemalatha said, that it became a tree. So when we are talking about a rhizome, I mean, we have to think about a rhizome not as the image of something that is growing, but the image of something that has infinite fertility at every node that can become something else. You don't know what it's going to become. So it captures its movement in its static nature. Similarly with that spider web, right? It seems to be static, but actually it's dynamic. It's everywhere. That you don't know where it'll be. So these kind of paradoxical images are images that are both still and moving, because there is movement within it. And the time image is like that, what the tree that Hemalatha was talking about, where there is something static, there seems to be something static, but that something static contains infinite movement within it. See, it's generating movement. It can change into something else. See, it still remains a tree, but it is changing its dimensions, the way in which it comes together, the number of branches it has, so where it's going to branch. So it's almost like it's a tree, but it's a tree that has the rhizome within it, almost. So I think that paradoxicality of the image which does not stop at being static, but has movement in it, is part of this, understanding that we have to reach for.
and just a very brief image about the heart. I realized I was reading about the actual biological physical heart, that when it is occluded, when there are arteries that are occluded in the heart actually creates alternative ways for the blood to flow in order to achieve its purpose. And so like a rhizome, it moves the blood all around. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting.
Absolutely. Sucandra.
Yes, thank you, Debashish. When I heard you speak, Debashish, I think this is like why it's so important for us to understand the mind, because if everything is always fluctuating, everything is always moving, right? And the mind is in control of our experiences, everything even we're seeing and experiencing right now, we're all having our own reality, and it's very different, even though it seems like it's exactly the same thing. I think this is why when we understand our mind, we can bring calmness to our mind, and then we can all begin to see reality. What is the truth? What's truer than that? And I once heard in Sanskrit they would say Om Tat Sat, right? So how can we go a little bit further? And I think for me, I love these inquiries so much. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sucandra. I think we're at the end of our time, and also at the end of our symposium. It's been a wonderful 2 days. All our panels have been recorded, and I think we'll be able to put them up and have them. I think I'll turn it over to Jonathan to say a few words about the future of these 2 days, and also of the East-West Psychology Symposium. Jonathan, please.
Yes, thanks, Debashish. Thanks for moderating 2 of our panels, and thanks for everybody for being here. There's a lot of people that have attended all 3 sessions, and really appreciate that. It's really important in how we are in community. But everything's been recorded, so yes, I will release everything on our YouTube channel, and I'll also send out the full brochure and upload that to SharePoint with all of the abstracts and everything and bios of so we can add this great 2-day symposium to the archive of EWP history. So with that, we'll see you all either in summer semester courses in the fall, and definitely next year in the next symposium.